Welcome everybody to our GIS seminar today. My name's Liz David Barrett and I'm the Director of the Governance and Integrity Anti-Corruption Evidence Programme. And we're really delighted today to have such a great lineup of speakers to be talking about such an important topic, looking at the role of consultants and how they are often involved in enabling and orchestrating state capture and kleptocracy. So we're focusing in on this particular type of professional service provider, largely consultants, and also looking at lawyers. The way that we're going to run this is to have some short interventions from each of our 5 speakers. So they're going to speak for 5 to 7 minutes each. And we will then open up for questions and answers. So if you've got any questions that are arising, do be thinking about them as we go through. And when we get to the end, you can either raise your hand and join the conversation or type them in the chat and I'll read them out. We are recording this session just to make everybody aware of that, and we will make the recording available within a few days after the event. The order that we're going to go in is we're going to hear first of all from Corentin Cohen, then we're going to go to Devi Pillay, then we'll hear from Alexander Cooley, then John Heathershaw, and finally Tena Prelec. So Corentin, I'd like to hand over to you to start with. Corentin is a junior research fellow in politics at St. Peter's College, Oxford University, and also formerly a Marie Curie research fellow at Oxford in the Department of Politics and International Relations. So Corentin, thank you for making it through a tropical cyclone to be with us today. Over to you for your introduction.
Thank you very much, Liz, and thank you very much to GIS for inviting me for this discussion. Very stimulating program, and thanks for Georgia also for the invitation. My research is about the role of global management consultant firm and the Big Four. So that's how, and that's what I'm going to look at today when I'm thinking and using the term consultant, which is very broad, right? I think these firms have an underlooked role as enablers of illicit financial flow and corruption. There's a very famous case in South Africa with the state capture. I'm certain Devi will touch on that soon. But there are also very fascinating stories arising from Angola, from Brazil, from many different countries. And I'll try to highlight some of the features of these companies, why I think they're relevant and why we should think more about them as enablers. And also get into the bigger picture and how we can think about this professional and how they operate with other professionals, which we are more familiar with, the lawyers, the wealth managers, some of the accountants, local accountants. So most of the literature is focused on global management consulting firms and the Big Four, the accounting firms. It's focused on Europe, North America, with the idea that they can enable accounting fraud, right? But these firms are really global. They serve most of the listed companies in the world. They have offices and clients in more than 100 countries. And I think one of the very interesting features of this firm that we need to discuss is the vast range of services that they integrate, right? And we tend to think about them as accountants, as facilitators who work on management, on processes. But actually, I think we should rather see them as concierge, right? Because, and here again, most of the literature is focused on accounting, but they offer key services to both the private and the public sector. So there's obviously the case of the accounting that helps to uphold legitimacy. And we've seen cases like in Angola, where Isabel dos Santos has been using the reputation of its auditors to shield and to protect the reputation, right? But the kind of services that they offer go well beyond this. Most of these firms have developed law practices, right? I think KPMG is one of the biggest law firms in the world now. They are they involve in valuation services. They have practice that focus on merger and acquisition. They're involved in the restructuring of companies. They even have individual and private wealth focused practices, right? And on the meantime, they operate in the public service and public sector too. So what is striking, as I'm mostly working on Africa and Brazil, is that some companies like KPMG or Deloitte have been auditing election, for instance. They have been creating citizenship and residence by investment program. They shape new public institutions. They help countries to devise new IT solutions, biometric programs. They've been involved in the redesigning of cities, of university program, through all this country-specific region or industry development plans. You've probably came across this, the future of this country, 2050, 2060. In the meantime, they also help the client to negotiate loans. So here we have different range of services that are under the radar, but are actually connected and organized in small number of firms, right? Which I think we could see as hubs. And we tend to think about these firms through the influence that they have over the client. And I'm certain that Devi will tell you some of the stories about this influence. I think one other approach is how to think about how they connect, how they create relationship between their own network, how they facilitate this relationship between the private and the public sector, how they connect their own client with some new investors, for instance, how they create the infrastructure that allows this kleptocrats, for instance, and foreign companies to work together and facilitate the emergence of this new institution, of new platform of contracts, right? So maybe more like as brokers, as intermediaries, right, who have a key role but overlooked in the production of this kleptocratic network we're discussing today. Just to take one example that arises from South Africa, one of the key roles of KPMG, which audited most of the Gupta conglomerate companies, was that it introduced the Gupta to some of these other member firms. KPMG South Africa connected the Gupta with KPMG in the Emirates and helped the Gupta to have access to other service providers, such as law firms, asset managers, different kind of investors. And they play this role as an intermediary, enabling the offshoring of wealth, right, in this case, enabling to set up new structures that were much more complex. So that's, I think, where we see these different strengths that I mentioned of expertise, the very local one, the very global one, the different fields, the different markets, the different professional practices that are connected together, right? You have one client, you help the client with the audit, with the accounting, but you can also advise on what's the best structure, what are the investment strategy to run a business between, in this case, it was between Dubai and India, but there are other occurrences of that. So the big question for me that it raised is how we can think about all these service providers working together to shield private wealth. And how we can connect that with some of the research that we already have and some other professions that are much more on the radar. I think like the law firms, the PR professionals, the asset manager, the wealth managers, and how we can think about that beyond the idea of the type of enablers, right? Because all these practices are actually connected and related. So we often use the idea of a market of services, which I think is actually a good way to describe how things work, but raise quite some important question here that needs, I think, discussion. What are the boundaries between these markets? How do they connect? What if the price is not very clear and we don't have like a clear market, but also many different relationships that allow kleptocrats potentially to select and to test what they want, if service can be provided on a ad hoc basis, if they are not standardized, right? Which means that if you put yourself in a position of a kleptocrat, you need a wide range of private bureaucrats and private actors, the registering agents, the lawyers, the accountants, the management consultant, the wealth manager, the asset managers, the private intelligence we hear of today too, the PR firms, the lobbyists abroad. How can we think about them together? And my proposal is to see this industry and maybe these markets, which are not clearly defined, as one form of a private bureaucracy of capitalism that may enable private actors and kleptocrats to operate, right? They are people who know and who define themselves through their knowledge, their expertise of the different sovereign jurisdiction where they operate, and who are able then to guide their clients, basically to arbitrage, to access the law when they need to organize the relationship between different corporate entities, to have access within the states directly when they need to, and to protect wealth when needed through these complex setups. So I think there's instances of this problem of certain bureaucracy that we see here. Formally, we can think about in some investment consortium, we see that a law firm, a consultancy work together. They have different roles that are well established, but it's also something that occurs informally, right? Where a kleptocrat will call in different group of advisors and use these different services to protect wealth. So maybe one of the questions we'll have to discuss if you accept this proposal and this idea, this hypothesis of a private bureaucracy, is to start thinking about what makes that social capital. Is it local? Is it global? Is it related to one practice? Is it related to one specific of contacts that these service providers are? And maybe we'll be able to establish a hierarchy, or at least to understand how they relate together and how they can operate. And I'll stop on that, but thank you very much, and I look forward to the discussion.
That's great. Thanks very much, Corentin, for setting the scene there with lots of provocative questions and a sense of how these companies operate. We're going to go now to Devi Pillay. Devi is a research fellow on the GIACE program based here at the University of Sussex, but also bringing rich experience from working in South Africa, including at the Zondo Commission. And Devi, you have some slides to share, I believe.
Yes.
Great. Over to you.
Is that showing up?
All good. Yeah.
Great. Thank you so much, Liz. What I'm going to talk about today is I'm presenting a little bit of work from a working paper that we recently published at GIACE. It's a case study from South Africa that looks at the role of McKinsey Company and its partnership with two local consulting firms in South Africa and their participation in certain state-owned enterprises. South Africa is a really interesting case, particularly because of the wealth of the information that we got out of the Zondo Commission, which was this years-long judicial inquiry into corruption and state capture. And particularly this case, the McKinsey case, we have the benefit of hours and hours of testimony, not just from consultants who are involved in that, including a lot of documentary evidence, but also from senior officials who worked within these organizations while this was going on. So we have a lot of information about how these firms actually work and the relationships that they form within public sector organizations. A really unprecedented view of what's happening on the inside. In this particular case, I can't go into too much detail in the time involved, but I'll give the broad strokes. We have two major state-owned entities that are involved, which is Transnet, which is the freight rail agency, state-owned, and Eskom, which is the electricity provider in South Africa. Both of these were deeply embroiled in corruption scandals during the Zuma years. And the crux of it really is that the president and his appointed ministers of public enterprises very sort of deliberately staffed the top echelons of these state-owned entities with allies who were closely linked to the Gupta family, which was a very powerful family that Zuma and particularly his son were deeply involved with and in business with. And once those people were in power within Transnet and Eskom, they initiated a number of governance reforms that essentially centralized a lot of governance and decision-making power and allowed them to control and approve a lot of the procurement decisions of those organizations without any kind of external controls. These organizations, and I particularly focus on the Transnet case because it's sort of the ground zero of the state capture years, which is they were doing a lot of infrastructure investments. So they were spending billions of rands on purchasing new locomotives from foreign equipment manufacturers. And this is where McKinsey and the two local firms, which are called Regiments and Trillion, came in. They were hired to work on the acquisition of these locomotives as sort of transaction advisors. The long and short of what happened is that McKinsey entered into an agreement with Regiments. Regiments is not owned by the Gupta family, but it was closely controlled by their senior kind of lieutenant in the enterprise, a man called Salim Essa. And they agreed that they would work together as partners for this work for Transnet and Eskom, as long as Regiments and Trillion was able to send sort of between 30 and 50% of their proceeds onwards towards the sort of Gupta network of companies that was operating like a laundromat. And in exchange, Regiments and Trillion would use their close connections to these senior officials and to their bosses in order to make sure that they were able to receive these lucrative contracts. And over 4 years, I think the McKinsey Regiments Consortium was awarded about 8 contracts from Transnet, all sort of confidential, confined, skirting all of the procurement rules, incredibly lucrative for them. And once they were in place with one contract, they were able to sort of embed themselves into the organization, and their contracts kept ballooning, extending in scope and expanding to the point that they were pushing out a lot of the sort of internal capacity and expertise that was already present within the organization. And I think there's sort of 2 very interesting things about what's happened here. The first is that sort of on the face of it, these contracts are corrupt. So just like any other supplier, many during this period, foreign suppliers like, SAP, for example, were in this relationship where they would hire subcontractors or would pay kickbacks in order to secure lucrative contracts. That's sort of the first part of it that's corrupt. The second and more interesting part is how they use their position as transaction advisors to facilitate further corruption. So while advising on these this acquisition of locomotives, their calculations and the numbers that they were running for Transnet, many of which were proven through the judicial inquiry to be sort of false or based on deliberate errors, were used to justify all sorts of decisions that inflated these contracts, while those foreign suppliers who were benefiting from these mistakes were also paying kickbacks into the Gupta enterprise. At the same time, what was happening within the organization is that those senior officials who were affiliated to the Gupta family were pushing out sort of Transnet's internal group treasury capacity and expertise, people who were pushing back against the use of consultants, who were questioning the wisdom of many of the decisions that the organization was starting to make. These people were sort of sidelined, abused, and pushed to leave the organization, to the point that what was once sort of one of the best sort of group treasuries in the world has been pretty severely hollowed out. And this kind of decapacitation has now led to this kind of cycle where there is now a genuine need to outsource for many of these functions because the capacity no longer exists within the organization. And the level above all of this is that the governance controls that were being continuously eroded in order to facilitate the work that the consultants were doing has left the organization in a very, very difficult place that is still struggling to recover from, even almost 10 years after all of this was exposed. A couple of interesting things that I will mention is, the key thing here really is these 2 local firms, Regiments and Trillion, didn't have any capacity or expertise to do the kind of work that they were hired to do. They never would have been able to get these contracts from Transnet and Eskom in the first place. But because McKinsey has this reputation as being an incredibly sort of credible, global, multinational firm, that cachet was used to bring in these subcontractors and partners, while Regiments and Trillion never underwent any scrutiny. They were never evaluated according to the procurement processes at all. So they skirted on that reputation. And once they were embedded in the organization, they were just sort of given more and more work, and the scope of their contracts continued to expand to the point that they were, began to take over the functions that were originally awarded to McKinsey. McKinsey just ceded a whole lot of the work to their subcontractors and continued to happily work on other programs within the organization. So that's sort of the main mechanism that we see here. And though McKinsey sort of tried to claim that they had done nothing wrong beyond perhaps not having the wisest choice in partners, they were eventually forced to plead guilty to FCPA violation charges, which they've now had to pay sort of massive fines both in the US and in South Africa. And this little diagram just shows you the sort of, all the way from the president to the overseeing ministry to the individual state-owned entities, how those kind of controls and accountability mechanisms were eroded, and how people staffed at every level of the public sector in this had direct links to the Gupta enterprise. And that's what allowed Trillian and regiments to sort of be gatekeepers and power brokers here, which made them so valuable to McKinsey because they were able to get so much work out of it. And I think there's two really interesting things about this case, and then I'll finishing up. The first is very much in line with what Corentin was talking about. It's really interesting to look at how these firms form relationships. So the first level of that is looking how the global and the local partnerships and how they're able to use each other in order to profit. And the second is to look at how the consultants form relationship with the officials and the representatives of the public sector and are able to become embedded within these organizations. And a clear example of this in the South African case is how when senior officials moved from Transnet to Eskom, they brought McKinsey and regiments and Trillian with them and sort of immediately began to duplicate the same scheme within the new organization. So you can see very clearly how those relationships operate in practice. And the second thing is the particular type of work. There was a very broad array of professional enablers involved with the Gupta network, accountants, lawyers, PR firms. All of them are very interesting stories. I'm trying to get to the bottom of what's unique about management consulting and financial advisory work. And it really is the power here to influence decisions that are being made by public sector bodies, whether it's which locomotives to acquire, how much those things are worth paying, into sort of more serious decisions like what happened with Bain and the South African Revenue Service, for example, that like restructured and dismantled some of their investigative capacity, their ability to pursue corruption and state capture. And of course, management consultants have this kind of funny position, unlike some of the more traditional professions. They often don't have sort of industry standards, regulatory bodies, or even professional associations that do give kind of some level of industry standardization and oversight. Very often this simply doesn't exist. And then the last thing that I talk about a bit in my paper is about the remuneration models and how the sort of success fees or at-risk fees that they're able to charge for their kind of work is particularly vulnerable to abuse and corruption. I'm going to leave it there. Thank you very much, Liz.
Super. Thanks so much, Devi. And the link to the paper is in the chat. But we're going to zoom over from South Africa to Central Asia now. And we're first of all going to hear from Alexander Cooley. Alex is the Clare Toe Professor of Political Science at Barnard College at Columbia University. Alex, over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Liz. It's a pleasure to be on this panel on this important topic. Collectively, John and I are going to be talking about Central Asia and the case of Kazakhstan, and we're going to be doing it also discussing the evolution of another professional consultancy, and that is the role of the crisis manager. And so I will make sort of 3 points on this, including introducing a bridge case, and then John will further elaborate and look at a couple of more contemporary examples. I think crisis management, traditionally, when it was done in state, has been a political function that has evolved to kind of address 3 issues, right? What's an organizational crisis? It's something that threatens the high priority values of the organization or maybe the organization itself. And it happens within a restricted amount of time in which a response can be made. And it's unexpected or anticipated, right? And there's been different definitions, but those are the 3 sort of central elements. Before the outsourcing of state functions, this was something that was handled discreetly within states, right? And most of the international relations literature viewed crisis management as a pivotal function, but one that was so important, it was sensitive and it was handled in-house. And even a designated crisis manager would not usually be named, but they were absolutely pivotal in smoothing things over and getting a government to adapt. Second sort of point, crisis management then in the 1990s becomes another type of service that is outsourced either in a public-private partnership or through a consultancy contract. And whether it's through a political advisor, right, who happens to be on hand when a crisis is reached, or contracting with a consulting firm like McKinsey or a reputation management firm, right? They all deals with different aspects or an organizational crisis. I would say how this intersects with corruption is sort of at least twofold. In certain crises where you have authoritarians, where the regime is really on the line, crisis managers increasingly by themselves or in coordination with other organizations plan asset protection plans, right? And embroil themselves in kleptocratic networks to guarantee and protect the assets, maybe even provide an escape hatch, right? For regimes that might be on the line. And then two, and this is something John will talk more about, they actually target NGOs and journalists and anti-corruption investigations during the crisis itself and in its fallout, right? And so they have that function as well. So yes, it's one of many types of functions, but I think crisis management has to intersect with all the things that keep an authoritarian regime in power, especially a kleptocratic one. And that's incredibly important, as we'll see in the Kazakh case. My very final point, before I hand it over to John, is to talk about a case that kind of bridges these two eras. And that's the case of James Giffen, who was political advisor to the government of Kazakhstan. He's well known, I think, by most people on this Zoom as having facilitated half a dozen corrupt oil deals with Kazakhstan in the 1990s with oil majors. He was indicted in 2003 on violations of the FCPA. We've posted a link to his last oral history that he gave at my university at the Harriman Institute, where he talks about some of these functions. But analytically, what we'd like to point out is that Giffen himself became part of the Kazakh state in that transition period. Right? He was essentially part of the Kazakh government in the late 80s. And then when he switched this from Chevron negotiator to political consultant for Nazarbayev, he started organizing Kazakhstan's relations with the outside world until the crisis of his own involvement in corruption really ends his association with Nazarbayev. So in some ways, he's a fascinating figure because post early 1990s, we have these sort of very respected service providers now directly being engaged and contracted to take on these roles. But Giffen himself was the original sort of bridge between sort of doing it in-house and then using his vast network to provide every kind of service to the young Kazakh government, quite an insecure President Nazarbayev in the 1990s. John?
Okay, thanks, Alex. Yeah, I'll just pick up where you left off. And just to say, we review some of the quite limited literature on external consultants and authoritarian states, particularly in crises. And in general, there, the lesson is that authoritarians tend to co-opt external consultants who adjust their messaging and recommendations to conform with regime sensitivities. And in the two cases we have in the paper, which is presently under review, so it can't be shared as a paper, but it will eventually come out, we hope. We have a little bit of variation there. So we have one kind of external consultant who's coming in episodically and quite momentarily, actually, and another much longer term relationship. So it allows us to explore what's happening there and how time matters. So two episodes in Kazakhstan's post-independence period are particularly instructive, and there are two cases. And they represent points of acute regime crisis and political instability. So that's firstly the fallout of the Kazakh authorities' crackdown on protesting oil workers in the western city of Zhanaozen in late 2011, when 17 protesters were killed. And then secondly, the bloody January 2022 crackdown by Kazakh security services on loyalists and militias loyal to former President Nursultan Nazarbayev and his inner circle. So instructively, these cases differ in the nature of the crises themselves, the identities and strategies of the consultants engaged in the crisis management, and the international networks that these consultants leveraged. In the first case, crisis response was led by former UK Prime Minister turned political guru and guardian of the Liberal International Order, Tony Blair, who drew upon his international contacts to craft the message that would acknowledge the concerns of the international community and yet underscore Kazakhstan's commitment to Western partnerships. And in the second case, we focus on the roles of Ron Wahid and his colleague, Lord David Evans, a member of the British Second Chamber of the British Parliament, of the private intelligence firm Arcanum Global, that provided a wide range of gatekeeping and garbage canning services, including defending the Nazarbayev elite's assets from the new government via complex shell companies through the UK and US, apparently playing an arbitrage role in the redistribution of assets between members of the old and new elites, and finally developing legal strategies in the aftermath designed to suppress investigative reporting on the financial activities of these Kazakh elites. So in the interest of time, I won't go into any level of detail. We can put a link in the chat to the reporting on the Arcanum case, because that's already out in a book I co-authored with Tena Prelec, who's also on this call, and Tom May. But maybe just to sort of say some summary comments and then finish. So the crisis management services offered by Wahid, Evans and Arcanum differed from those offered by Tony Blair and his Tony Blair associates. These differences reflect the different structural position of the two consultants with respect to the Nazarbayev regime. While Blair was a senior advisor operating with a two-person team in Kazakhstan for the duration of a time-limited contract, Wahid embedded with the Nazarbayev elite with clientelistic ties to some of its members. And we think these date back to at least 2007. So while both Blair and Wahid are enablers of the Nazarbayev regime, Wahid, Evans and their associates, and Evans here is also he's appointed to the Second Chamber of Parliament by Tony Blair. So there's a little bit of crossover in the cases, which I think is interesting. But Wahid, Evans and their companies were effectively actors in the regime's kleptocratic enabler networks, and thereby played a much more involved and interested role in managing the crisis, because they were themselves to benefit financially and reputationally, potentially putting aside damage. So some of the things they did, they were involved in an asset dump out of Kazakhstan in 2022, involving around about $1.6 billion of assets through a holding company in which they both served as directors and therefore had an interest. They were also contracted to provide reputational services to the tune of about $4.2 million in 2022. And they took aggressive defamation action against UK journalists that included OCCRP, Open Democracy, TBIJ, and the UK's Daily Telegraph. And the papers for those actions, I think, against Open Democracy were signed by Lord David Evans himself. So there's something quite interesting going on here in terms of elite networks between Britain and Kazakhstan. And I think the comments made previously by Corentin and Devi really, it affirms a great deal of what they said too, I think, about that network form and that sort of revolving door between the private sector and the state, which it matters here as well. I could go into much more detail on that if I had time, but I don't. I'm going to stop there and pass back to Liz.
Excellent. It's really fascinating stuff, John. Thank you very much. We're going to move straight on to Tena Prelec. Tena is an assistant professor in politics and international relations at the University of Rijeka. Also a co-author of John's, of course, on their excellent book, Indulging Kleptocracy. And Tena, you're going to be talking about the role of lawyers. So over to you.
Exactly. Thank you, Liz. I hope you can hear me and that you can see everything. Well, yeah, fantastic. My contribution is going to focus on a GIA's project that I've been working on with Robert Barrington, Georgia Garrett, and Pepe Tunin, all from the University of Sussex. The project is titled Gatekeepers, Enablers, and Technicians. And basically, within this topic of professional service providers and transnational kleptocracy or private bureaucracy, as Corentin has called it, there is the widespread recognition that indeed we need to talk about lawyers. The reason why we need to do so is, of course, that lawyers occupy indeed a key role in the dynamics of transnational kleptocracy. Many kind of services were mentioned during the course of the panel, but from real estate to offshoring to defamation law to reputation management, law firms are very, very often involved in many of these activities. But there is a second aspect that moved us to work on this topic specifically, and not from the area of, let's say, risk analysis or of the analysis of what is going on or the incidence of it. So of kind of not looking at the impact of it or at the, let's say, the policy, but rather at this very slippery issue which deals with ethics, with the culture behind what moves people and what moves lawyers in this case specifically to engage in servicing individuals whose wealth is illicit, right? So it starts from this recognition that there is a big tension, a gap, let's say, in the way that lawyers operate. So, in theory, it's a profession that is meant to uphold righteous values, make us stick, to the rule of law, and to really act on behalf of a client in their best interest. But on the other hand, why is it that this harmful behavior persists? How does it come to the decision making from the part of the lawyer to take up clientele which might have been involved in such activities? So we talk about kind of this tension between sticking to this letter of the law only, to what is in there, but on the other hand, kind of breaking or breaching the spirit of the law. So kind of the spirit of what the profession would be meant to be doing, right? So in this sense, we look at this gap, and this gap is very, very present in the international anti-money laundering system. And the reason for that is that the international money laundering system is very ill-equipped to deal with wealth, with financial flows that are coming from countries where state capture is markedly present. And the reason that is so is that by constructing criminality in a very narrow way, it is very difficult to capture the proceeds of kleptocracy, state capture, and corruption in countries where, let's say, rule of law is the norm, let's say in the UK, which is the country that we've been looking at, because very often there is the absence of a predicate crime in the country where this wealth has been made, basically, because the idea is that since it's easy in a condition of state capture to mold the rules and therefore to kind of legalize wealth that is illicit in its form or even illegal, this predicate crime basically loses its presence. We don't have it in the country where the money is laundered, right? So this is why the role of the lawyers as those who are able to make the choices of what is, let's say, lawful or not, or kind of legal versus illicit, and so on and so forth, are indeed fundamental in that. Because they are able to rewrite the narrative and potentially then to perpetuate this and to entrench and spread these kind of dynamics. So that's why this issue risks creating practices that are so-called lawful but awful. And it's interesting to note that in terms of this manipulation aspect, lawyers are among the professions that are most have the highest incidence of dark triad traits. So Machiavellianism, narcissism, psychopathy, these are personalities that are very, very prone to manipulation, basically, to be able to manipulate. And that's why this gap it becomes even riskier in this sense. So to break this cycle, we need to go towards clarity. So clarifying the gap. Of course, this is the rule of legislation, of kind of having safe reporting channels for whistleblowers and so on and so forth, but also deal with this almost intractable issue, which is the morals. How do we understand their ethical compass, and how do we end up shaping these decisions in a better way through policy? So how we did that, we conducted a series of semi-structured interviews into batches. We also did a large-scale comment analysis and analyzed codes of conduct as well. And very briefly, we came up with 4 typologies that operate across fault lines. So I already mentioned this tension between the spirit of the law and the letter of the law, the public interest and the private interest, the collective versus the individual. So we have the reformers, those that stand at one side of the spectrum and that are more advocate for reforms and professional accountability. So they recognize that there is an issue in terms of lawyers being involved in this gatekeeping or enabling of transnational kleptocracy. And they say that there is an external intervention that should be required. Engage skeptics that kind of recognize the problem, but on the other hand are cautious about regulatory overreach. Then we had minimalists, so those that maintain that it's legality, so more on the letter of the law side of things. So they say that the lawyer should not be engaged in interpreting what is before their eyes. They should just stick to implementing the letter of the law. And then the defenders, who are those who indeed reject the notion that there is a problem at all. And quite on the contrary, they even say that there is a witch hunt against lawyers in this sense. So very briefly, 4 key points that emerge from this research. We checked several potential value creators, including, for instance, education or the environment, peers, and so on. And we saw that it's at the level of the firm that this value creation is the highest. So this potentially is also the most interesting part for policy action, actually. Second is the part about geopolitics, which was really interesting because some of them said we all dropped our Russian clients overnight, but no one asked us about the Gulf states, about the Saudis, about other geographies. So whereas this geopolitical developments gave the spur for some reform, right, for some law firms to say, okay, we're not accepting clients from a certain geography, from Russia in this case. So at least the problem that there is this interaction between the UK in this case and other countries in kleptocracy was recognized. This fact that it was only applied to certain countries was a two-edged sword, to say the least. Third point, reputation as a proxy for ethics. So it was, at the end of the day, the response was always about defending the reputation of the law firm rather than a deep-seated concern for what exactly, the public good is and what should be the ethical thing to do. But fourth and more hopeful part, they are part of the problem, as we can all agree on, I think. But some of them, and in some ways, we really see that they can also be part of the solution, lawyers themselves, because we also saw a lot of lawyers being proud of the firm they worked for, exactly for virtues rather than for not so virtuous ends. So in this sense, and linking it to Corentin's initial remarks, we conceptualize them as brokers of legitimacy, basically those who are able to ferry the kleptocrats from a situation in which the wealth is illicit, if not illegal, to a legitimacy of this acquirement of wealth and also of reputation. And in that sense, they help sustain this private bureaucracy as well, in coordination sometimes with other figures such as consultants or risk managers and others that we talked about today. I will stop here. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Tena. It is going to be time to move to our discussion. We've got 15 minutes left for the question and answer part of today's seminar. So do raise your hand if you would like to ask a question, or feel free to also put your question in the chat if you would prefer to do it that way. We've had some really provocative interventions here from all of our speakers. We've heard about cases from different parts of the world, and I think we've really learned a lot about how these intermediaries are providing not just practical services, but also lending legitimacy, credibility, reputation in ways that can be very important to authoritarian leaders. I am not seeing any hands up yet, which is a surprise to me. Oh, we have one question coming up in the chat. So this is a question from Jasmine to Tena's presentation. Did lawyers give thoughts on what could be part of the solution to a shared ethics? Tena, would you like to come back on that straight away?
Yes, thank you for the question. I would also invite Robert, who I think is among the audience, to weigh in as well. So I think that what I mentioned was more that seeing and hearing some of these lawyers actually being moved to do the right thing rather than just look for the financial incentive is what moved us as researchers to say, look, they can also be part of the solution, right? So my remarks were along those lines. But I also have to say that I think that it's already happening in certain respects. We have some organizations such as TIPS in London, that is collecting people from various professional service providers, including lawyers, and from other professions as well, who are all working in professions that might be at risk of enabling kleptocracy, and are asking all those questions, and are basically through peer work and through investigating together and asking together questions about corruption and enabling of corruption. I think it's automatically a way towards which these cultures can be moved, and a different narrative can be put up. So I see this this kind of clubs type of approach of people coming together and thinking about how it can be done better, a very stimulating and an interesting way of being part of the solution. So that would be my preferred solution. Perhaps Robert has something to add.
I think I happen to know from my insider information that Robert's had to go off and run another seminar for our students. We do have Georgia online. So Georgia, if you would like to come in, feel free to. But unless we hear from Georgia, let's go to the next question. So we've got Karok. Karok, would you like to ask your question?
Yes, hi. Yeah, I was wondering about the role of the Big Four in bridging the gap between IFI and companies or corporates in these state capture, because it not only creates legitimacy, it also opens a gate for financial flow internationally, so on and so forth. Has there been any examples that you've come through that illustrates that?
Okay, given that we've got lots of speakers, I'm just going to take the other question too, and then we can work out who wants to answer which question. So let's hear also from Marina.
Thank you, Liz. I also have a question for a couple of our speakers. My question is about Ukraine. Maybe somebody of you is familiar with this situation that most of law enforcement officers of Yanukovych period, it was 15 years ago, now they are lawyers and they give consultations to the office of the president. And as we know, a couple of weeks ago, Yermak, the head of the office of the president of Ukraine, lost his job, and I think that he was consulted by that lawyers from that period. Could we find any maybe similarities with South Africa case or with Kazakhstan case, or there are a lot of differences? Very interesting to hear a new opinion about it.
Thanks so much, Marina. I'm also going to read out two more questions that we've got now in the chat. So we've got from Zakir. Any observations or insights re the internal guardrail roles or functions of these consulting firms? So, for example, the legal and integrity, compliance, risk management, especially in the large ones. So, are they trying to restrain this, I guess, is the question, and getting pushback, or perhaps not even trying? Abdulwali asks, all of these problems identified go back to the idea of profiteering at any cost. Is there a need for character education in higher education when these professionals are trained? So ideas about getting them when they're at that formative stage of education. And then Basir, question to all panel members, whether lawyers or political advisors and crisis managers carry out significant deception, fraud and disinformation. And then we've also got Anthony now. What role is there for representative industry bodies in policing lawyers and other professionals? Disappointing that in South Africa so little has been done by the legal profession's disciplinary bodies, for example. So excellent, good, rich set of questions there. We've got 9-10 minutes left, so that's about 2 minutes per speaker. And if we go in the order that we in fact, let's go in reverse order. So let's go to Tena, then John, Alex, Devi, Corentin. So Tena, your couple of minutes.
Yeah, I already had more than a minute before, so I'll only answer one question, which is the one about education. So this is one we tested in the interviews, and I was surprised to find out that it's less relevant. It seems to be less relevant for value creation of lawyers than I thought it would be. Basically, it's more at the level of the firm that these values are created, and it's kind of a gatekeeping exercise at the beginning of it, because people joining the firms more or less know what they're going to get. So there is one aspect of it in this sense that there is the they attract people who will fit in, and on the other hand, you also need to take into consideration the fact that if they attract very young people, they're able to mold them a little bit better. But on the other hand, young lawyers also seem to be those more inclined to think from a value-based perspective. So it's a mixed picture, but yes, it's firm over education in our findings.
Thanks so much, Tena. John?
Yeah, thank you. The question from Marina on Ukraine, I can't really speak to the case with Yermak and Yanukovych officials, but I think the comparison to Kazakhstan would be that we know that these kinds of cronies and the external consultants, and it's the external consultants bit I want to emphasize, can switch sides when you get a regime change. They don't go away, they reposition themselves. So the Arcanum case I talked about is a great example of that, because as the Nazarbayev regime is losing power, the Arcanum people are repositioning themselves, and they end up effectively switching sides when they do a deal over the assets, whereby people they previously worked with, like the former Prime Minister Orenbayev and the former Justice Minister Beketayev, effectively become their enemies and actually their opponents in legal disputes. Part of the reason we know about these cases is the legal disputes between former regime members and the external consultants, or at least which the external consultants are involved in as being directors of the company, which is actually the litigant. So those legal disputes are how we know this. And so you get that side switching and maneuvering. And I think that indicates the network form that this takes. We're not talking about clearly demarcated regimes of power who stick together. The elites defect, the networks change, and that's the fundamentally network-based form of political order in these environments. And I'm afraid for both Kazakhstan and Ukraine, but I perhaps increasingly also the United States, when I heard Devi speak, I kept thinking, yeah, Trump's doing that, Palantir, Teal. But, many forms of political order can be subject to these kinds of networks, these kind of oligarchic type networks. Over to Alex.
Yeah, I'll echo everything John said. I would like to answer the question about professional associations, because I think that's a really important advocacy target, actually. We talk a lot about how difficult it is to change policy, especially when governments have to take in account a number of sort of objective and domestic sort of political pressures, and especially on the transparency corruption front. But professional associations, I think, are more, I don't know if vulnerable is the right word, but they're more immediately accessible. They all have professional codes of ethics. They all have positions. Debates can be quite contentious. I'm reminded of the example of the American Bar Association that for the longest time pushed back against things like Corporate Transparency Act, creation of beneficial owner registries and so forth, but eventually came around because their own members, right, pushed this as a really important a goal within the broader transparency wave, and had quite a high level sort of battle. So I think the sort of common the common pushback and challenge across all these professional associations is this kind of commodity of privacy, right? The way it's presented by professional associations, that this is something that professional associations guarantee, right? The membership, that this is part of their profession, whether they're wealth managers, lawyers, right, accountants, and so forth. And so I think trying to rupture that, right, or at least putting some scope conditions on when is, sort of privacy, what are its limits within the other kinds of things, and how the professional association itself will be harmed, right, by going down a road where like absolute privacy is guaranteed at all time, is, I think, one way to think about advocacy. But yes, the organizations themselves, I think, are super important and legitimate targets.
Super, thanks, Alex. And I think actually, Tena's work has really interesting things to say about sort of the debate on this boundaries of that privacy and privilege. Over to Devi.
Thanks. I also wanted to quickly bring in about sort of industry bodies, which, in the South African case, they have been very slow to act, and where they have acted, they've kind of either slapped on a few fines, or where there were really egregious cases of misconduct, they have sort of debarred people. But I mean, the most consequence any private firm ever saw was Bell Pottinger being censured by the PRCA here in the UK, where they effectively collapsed after the South African case. And I'm sure all of those people have gone on to continue to have lucrative careers in PR management in other firms. But I mean, there can be decisive cases. It just very rarely happens. And in South Africa, we've seen an attempt to try and bring more professions into this space. There's this push, for example, for procurement professionals to create a profession, have associations and industry standards and things like that. And I think there is a place for that. But also, I mean, if you look at a lot of the GIS research, for example, jurisdictions that really emphasize this sort of compliance, self-regulation of professions haven't been seeing very effective results. So there also needs to be, I think, a bigger regulatory focus coming from the state, and particularly the state when they partner with private sector actors like consultants or lawyers or accountants and things like that. And then there was a question about sort of the internal guardrails in these organizations. When I worked at the Zondo Commission, we looked at quite a few of these private firms that were involved in state capture. Almost all of them had, for example, rules and guidelines against paying middlemen and facilitation payments in order to get contracts. A lot of their internal codes of conduct and documentation shows that they know that this is a problem, particularly in the African market, and that they should refrain from becoming involved in them. And all of them kind of broke through those rules because, none of that has any bite as long as this continues to be the most lucrative part of the market for them, which is these public sector contracts that are sort of just gifts that keep on giving. So yes, they had a lot of these internal functions. And in the wake of state capture, at least in South Africa, a lot of them have claimed to beef up these kind of internal controls and compliance procedures and things like that. I'm just skeptical that any of the incentives to follow those have actually changed until there are sort of more effective sanctions and consequence management for breaking those.
Thank you very much, Devi. And then a final word to Corentin.
I'll try to answer some of the questions and put them together, but basically I'm also very skeptical about the role of this professional association, especially for accountants. One reason for that is that in the case of accounting, and here again, we have to see like what are the difference between different regulated profession, how the regulation apply. If you think about management consultants, there's basically like no rule about conflict of interest, and what's the definition of what's a management consultant is very extensive. Accounting is a bit different; it's very local, national. But often you see that there's a kind of systematic conflict of interest I would like to highlight here, and revolving doors, in the sense that when the people who are establishing the regulation are often people from the Big Four, right? Because they are overrepresented in most of these bodies, right? And they are also the people who define what's a good compliance system, how you should implement some standard within organization, particularly private one, right? And they get paid to implement the system. And what we've seen over the last year is that they're more and more turning this into like a box-ticking exercise, where there's less and less judgment, less and less subjectivity, and more list of things that you need to match. So on the one hand, they're defining the standards by which they are operating, right? On the other, they're implementing the standards to their clients. And obviously, when you contract some of these professionals and these firms, you want to be on top and be playing by the gold standard, but this means that you're also protected and your interests align with the existing regulation. So for me, and we see that the role of this organization in which are also entry points in the public sector doesn't really help, and because they're so central in the practices, the setting of the standards, and in the implementation, there's a major conflict of interest because they all know how to play by the book and use the rules in the interest of the clients, which is often why we see that actually it's worse sometimes when it's the professional organization that regulates the trade, because they take very individual sanction and measures against when they see there are some obvious cases was in South Africa. But there's nothing about the systematic dimensions, nothing about the firm, nothing about the different partners, right? And they basically focus on the bad apples. It's always the same story, right? So I think I would be less confident about engaging with the association. It's probably important to do it. But here, I think there's at least in the case of accounting and maybe management consultants, there's like a fundamental conflict of interest and power that this firm play.
Thanks so much, Corentin. Okay, we have run over by a couple of minutes, but I think actually we've done an amazing job at extracting lots of fascinating analysis and cases from all of our really excellent speakers. So do check out the GIA's website, where you can find links to all of their work. There's a rich body of evidence there going back several years. With that, I will close today's seminar. Thanks very much to all of our speakers. Let's give them all a big round of applause, with or without sound on. And thanks very much to all of the audience for joining us as well.